Hello, this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm again joined by Keith Preston, Florian, and Aleksey. Today's discussion will be on Thomas Sowell's The Conflict of Visions. Of the four of us, only Aleksey and Keith have actually read the book all the way through. But since this was sort of your idea, Aleksey, why don't you sort of highlight the basic theme of the book and what you take away from it?
The Sowell's fundamental argument is that the difference between the left and the right consists in how they see human nature. The left tends to think that human nature is malleable, flexible, dynamic, and evolving, which leads them to believe that it's possible to create a utopian society. Essentially, there are no limitations. Sowell calls this the unconstrained vision of humanity. And an example of an unconstrained vision, as Sowell sees it, would be Godwin's, an eminent English novelist who argued that man can be perfected. And in that sense, Godwin, although he believed in the free markets, he also believed in the perfectibility of man. That sets him apart from Adam Smith, whom Sowell regarded as a proponent of the free markets who had a constrained vision of humanity. For Sowell, Adam Smith has a conservative worldview because Smith believes that no sort of economic policy can be maintained through the knowledge or the intellect of an economic planner. Smith believed that nations are more likely to prosper in a free market where essentially people can trade knowledge and turn ideas in terms of goods and services. Now, as far as Karl Marx is concerned, that would be the antithesis to Adam Smith. Marx and Marxist-Leninists have a clear-cut example of the unconstrained vision, where they argue that, in fact, the opposite of Smith's thesis is true, that we don't need the free markets because it's possible for a group of central planners to have a vanguard party that are going to be sufficiently well informed to plan the economy and to not only achieve economic prosperity, but to also create a society that is in every way superior to a capitalist society. The best example of such an unconstrained vision of humanity is Lenin's New Soviet Man, which is a general idea that through central planning and rigid top-down control of society, it's possible for the Soviet Union to create intellectually and morally superior humans. One way they try to prove this is by financing chess in the Soviet Union, by producing the finest players of the era, and by doing so, the Soviet Union tried to prove how malleable human nature is. As far as they were concerned, the Soviet Union produced the best chess players because of socialism, not because Soviets had the most genetically endowed players. And that is often the idea of Marxism. The human nature is part of the false consciousness. That it's the false consciousness of capitalism, so Marxists think. That Marxists tend to believe that there is no fundamental difference between the rich and poor. The reality is the poor are poor because they were defrauded by capitalists. And the way to change it, as Marxists would argue, is to essentially create a society where nobody believes in the limitations of human nature. In fact, there was a famous pioneer song. The pioneer camps were like Boy Scout camps for communists, where young people in the Soviet Union had to go to receive a handful of communist indoctrination. And the song that they sang went along the lines of this: if you don't want to do something, we'll force you, and if you don't know how to do it, we'll teach you. The implication is simple: that anybody can be taught to do anything, and as long as, of course, they're free from the false consciousness of capitalism. See, this is the epitome of an unconstrained vision. And this, interestingly, informs much of what the modern left believes in across the world, including the United States, Sweden, and Norway, and so on. For example, in many Scandinavian countries, women have ample opportunities and encouragement to go into the traditionally masculine occupations, such as engineering, mathematics, computer programming, you name it. You name it. And the result is surprising to them as far as they see it, as far as they think, as far as the unconstrained vision of humanity would inform them. There would be an equal number of men and women involved in any craft, any masculine craft. But what they see instead is the opposite. In Sweden, women are even less likely to become doctors or engineers or construction workers than they are in a clearly patriarchal society like Saudi Arabia. The implication is pretty clear that in a free society where there are no specific and rigidly prescribed gender roles, people are free to do as they wish. And the reality is that there are limitations within human nature. That women are generally less risk averse. More risk averse than men. Women take fewer risks by nature. And that is why in Sweden, despite the unconstrained vision informed politics and policymaking, there are still differences among the preferences that men and women have, and the career choices that they make. Now, as far as the constrained conservative vision of humanity is concerned, that is merely common sense. It's obvious that people are different as a matter of human nature, that no amount of communist pioneer school indoctrination will make anybody capable of anything. In fact, that's palpably false and hypocritical in the face of it. The communists who managed the Ministry of Sports were aware that some young athletes were more talented than others. Nobody thought that Garry Kasparov is just an average chess player. In fact, he was a remarkably talented young man. And the same goes for gymnasts, hockey players, whatever sport the Soviet Union wanted to excel in. And what's interesting about that is that the Communist Party has become conservative over time in the Soviet Union. In a way, they deviated from Lenin's new Soviet man vision to embrace a constrained vision of humanity. So how would an unconstrained perspective look like in this context? So they would argue that anybody who thinks that men and women have fundamental differences is a bigot, is a sexist. Anybody who thinks that there are differences between races must be a racist. After all, why is it that in the NBA, African American men are so overrepresented? Why is it that in Kenya, the Kenyan runners, marathon runners, are among the most skilled and among the most successful in the sport? Well, they would argue that since human nature is an illusion, and human nature is fundamentally unconstrained. Maybe it's about the weather, maybe it's about the climate. Maybe if we were to move to Kenya, and our children would be just as fast as the Kenyans. To me, that sounds like absolute nonsense. But if you have the unconstrained vision of humanity, you would have to argue that the reality is that you can make top athletes or top scientists out of any group of people. And then you got to ask them, what about Ashkenazi Jewish people? Why is it that they score among the highest in IQ tests? This is the constrained vision answer is obvious, that Ashkenazi Jews have genetics that give them a high IQ, but that comes at a high price, of course. They're prone to have a broad variety of illnesses that are quite uncommon among other ethnic groups. Since human nature is limited, there is a genetic lottery. And you can be talented at some things because you belong to a certain ethnic group, and you can have also genetic defects at the same time. So what would the unconstrained response to this be? First of all, they would say that an IQ test is fundamentally unacceptable because their assumption is that all groups are equal. So if you're saying that, one group does better on IQ tests than another, that must mean that you're a racist. You see, that's just, if you mention anything about IQ, you're going to get fired from academia. And see, this is where Thomas Sowell's point about the difference in the visions between liberals and conservatives makes sense. Dr. Lawrence Summers was a president of Harvard University when he decided to merely open the door to to a free-flowing exchange of ideas. And now Summers qualified his assertion, saying that he's not an expert in psychometrics. He just wants to consider the idea that perhaps there is a difference in IQ distribution among men and women. Now, he made it clear that he never said that men are superior in IQ to women. In fact, they're not. Both have an IQ of about 100. However, women are more likely to be average, while men tend to gravitate towards the extremes. And that is perhaps why we see so many men who appear to have an IQ that sets them apart from the mainstream society. Obviously, the smartest people we know are overwhelmingly male, but also are the dumbest. This is part of the reason why prison population is so predominantly male. The average IQ for career criminals between 80 and 85. It's in the mid to high 80s at the most. And clearly, when men are more likely to have an IQ in that range. Of course, the excess of testosterone may be the case, or rather disparity in testosterone levels between men and women is part of the explanation. The other part is IQ. And if you have a constrained vision of humanity, you accept that some people are naturally smarter than others, some people are naturally more neurotic than others, some people are more agreeable. In fact, as far as the Big Five is concerned, a conservative who has a constrained vision of humanity would think that it's obvious that women are more agreeable than men and a little bit more conscientious. That's human nature. On the other hand, if you have an unconstrained liberal vision of humanity, you would say, oh, it's all about socialization. It's all about nurture versus nature. Why are there differences between men and women? Well, maybe if we start raising men the way we raise women, well, we'd have a feminist utopia on our hands. That's a common argument on the left. Or why is it that there are racial disparities among academic achievement? No, it must be because of racism. Well, then one obvious question is this. Is it not clear that Ashkenazi Jews suffered so much more racism than any other ethnic group just about anywhere? What other ethnic group had to be remanded to the gas chambers? And what other ethnic group was expelled and marginalized in so many societies? Does it really make sense to say that the African Americans suffered as much as a group, as an ethnic group that was literally the victim of genocide? How about Armenians in Turkey? They were the first victims of genocide. Yet nobody is arguing that Armenians are having a similar issues with achievement, similar deficits in achievement the way that African Americans are. So that alone should provoke skepticism and as to whether the unconstrained vision of humanity makes sense. But if you are a true liberal, you would never accept any fundamental differences, any argument that there's got to be some kind of a fundamental difference between genders and races. In fact, they would go so far as to take the tabula rasa argument from John Locke to its most vicious extreme, to say that anybody can be anything. In fact, I remember Noam Chomsky saying this in a discussion on IQ, that if he were to go to rural Nicaragua and pick any random boy, any illiterate 8-year-old boy off the street and give him the best education in the Massachusetts, he'd be a student at MIT. Now, that's not that. If you have a constrained vision of humanity, to you this sounds like absolute nonsense. Yet, if you have an unconstrained vision of humanity, to you the answer is simple: that if there are any kind of disparities among achievement between groups, it's got to be a consequence of racism, sexism, oppression of some sort, intersectionality, and it behooves you to absolutely ignore all evidence showing that some groups were oppressed more than others, some groups rather achieve more than other groups, despite a history of being oppressed. The case in point being are the Armenians and the Ashkenazi Jews. Another dramatic case in point is the Tutsis, the Tutsi ethnic group in Rwanda, which suffered suffered discrimination at the hands of the Hutu racial extremists, who literally perpetrated the fastest genocide on their compatriots in the history of all civilization. Yet, despite this, the lighter-skinned Tutsi Africans remain among the highest achievers, not only in Rwanda, but also in all of Africa, most of Africa. In fact, Rwanda is one of the most economically accomplished nations in Africa, and they're among the safest nations as well. And among the people and the Africans and the Africans who have achieved the most in Rwanda overwhelmingly belong to the Tutsi groups. So one may wonder if human nature is an illusion, and any group, all groups are fundamentally equally talented, how is it that the Tutsis are achieving so much more in Rwanda than I dare say African Americans in the United States? And then one must wonder, okay, so if you take a fundamentally racist point of view and say that, well, all people of African descent are deficient, you've got to answer, you have a lot of explaining to do as well. How is it that some ethnic groups in Africa are so much more successful than others? And how is it that African Americans in the United States are much less successful than the Botswanans, for example, or the Tutsis of Rwanda? See, if you argue that human nature is constrained, you have a lot. You have a lot of leeway. You've got to understand that there are many different ethnic groups that exist with a broad variety of natural talents and defects, and this does not commit you to a racist point of view. See, liberals with an unconstrained vision of humanity would say that, oh, if you subscribe to Sowell's theory, you must be a racist, when in fact Thomas Sowell is black, as an African American who has no shame in saying that despite the history of racial oppression that African Americans have suffered, this is really not the main reason why African Americans are falling behind. So it's important to understand that much of the discussion that surrounds public policy is deeply entrenched in the unconstrained vision of the anointed, as Thomas Sowell calls it. Thomas Sowell wrote a sequel to the conflict of visions, the vision of the anointed, where he lambasted the liberal idea that, that there is no such thing as human nature, that it's fundamentally malleable. And a communist utopia, or any kind of utopia, is just around the corner if only the conservatives who believe in limitations of mankind accept their racist and sexist, and then they accept their self-censorship and excoriation and blah, 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 blah. But the reality is far more complicated. Human nature is limited, limits human achievement. I believe that the constrained vision of humanity is fundamentally correct. And so I will stop there. Guys, any questions about this fundamental theoretical orientation?
Well, I was going to ask, so Keith, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I read Sowell's book, Conflict of Visions, where he outlines his theory probably, I think it came out in the 80s. I read it in the early 90s. And then the follow-up as well, the Vision of the Anointed. And my take on this is that Sowell is one of the, of all American intellectuals, Sowell is probably one of my favorite ones from the right in terms of just being interesting. It's probably Chomsky is my favorite from the left, and Sowell from the right. They're from the same generation. They're both in their 90s now. But Sowell's contrast between the vision, between the constrained and unconstrained vision, I think is an interesting lens through which to view some of these questions. I tend to look at it like political ideologies and philosophies and things like that, or like lenses on a microscope or telescope, where you can switch lenses from time to time and get a different vantage point. And none of them are going to give you a complete picture, but you can also get a different angle and see things that you might not see with a different lens. And I definitely think Sowell's model of constrained versus unconstrained visions. And another way to frame that would be realist versus utopian visions. I think some people, it's easier to understand this concept if you frame it that way. And the way that this works is that, as Aleksey said, it gets down to how you view human nature and the nature of human societies. And also it's relevant to the conventional battle between left and right. Like there's this question of, well, what does it mean to be left versus right? Some people say it's constrained versus unconstrained visions, or realism versus utopia. Others say it's freedom versus power, or hierarchy versus equality, or tradition versus progress, or different things like that. I think all of these are interesting ways of looking at it. But I think also to understand Sowell's ideas better, it's helpful to put them in some kind of context. Like Sowell, as Aleksey said, is Black, and he grew up in Harlem in the 40s and 50s, and he eventually went to Harvard, and he went to I forget. He did his graduate work at the University of Chicago, where he studied under Milton Friedman. But Sowell was a Marxist at one point, and then eventually he went over to the more Chicago school, which is one of the free market schools of economics. And of course, Sowell is well known for having written a lot of books on economics. And one of the things he most specializes in is the sociology of race and that kind of stuff. But while I think that this way of looking at politics, the constrained versus an unconstrained vision, is helpful, it also has its limits. Now, clearly, we can look at thinkers from history, and say, well, that person had what Sowell would say is an unconstrained vision. Like one of my favorite examples is there's a quote from Trotsky where he says that under socialism, the average human type would rise to the level of Goethe or Marx or Aristotle. Well, we haven't seen any examples of that under actually existing socialism or anywhere else. So that's definitely an unconstrained vision. I think a lot of the kind of thought that Sowell criticizes is rooted in Enlightenment era thought. Like, and as Aleksey said, in one of Sowell's books, he mentions William Godwin, who was a prominent Enlightenment thinker. But you have out of the Enlightenment, you have this tradition associated with thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which says that human nature is basically benign or benevolent and only corrupted by institutions. And if you give people the right amount of education, or the right kind of parenting or nurturing, or the right material conditions or whatever, or the right political or institutional structures, then the benevolence of human nature will shine through, and people will be able to maximize their potential and rise to greater heights. And of course, out of this comes the idea of human perfectibility, that the human potential is limitless. And this was a popular model of thought in the 19th century, and it probably had to do with the very rapid technological and scientific progress that was made at that time, where people started thinking they could do anything. But as far as using this model of constrained versus unconstrained visions, I do think it's helpful as one of the lenses through which you can look at political debates. Now, I have a lot of problems with Sowell's application of this model. I don't know that a lot of the conclusions that he reaches are necessarily derivative of his actual theoretical framework, but it is an interesting way to look at it. Probably the aspect of Sowell's thinking that's most compelling is when he talks about group differences. And I think it's really in this area that he shines the most, because it is his main area of specialization. But he talks about disparities among groups, because on the modern left, the greatest sin of all is when there's disparities between groups, when you have higher poverty rates among some groups, or you have some groups lesser represented in institutions or professions and things like that. And the implicit assumption in that is that if social conditions were what they need to be, then you would have an equal number of, say, ethnic groups, of representatives of different ethnic groups, or at least a proportional number relative to population size, as, say, doctors and lawyers. Like if there was no bad conditions, if there was no racism, if there was no poverty, if there was no bad parenting or whatever, if there were no underfunded schools, then you would see, at least 13% of all doctors and lawyers and scientists would be Black, and whatever the current percentage of Hispanics is, you'd have at least that much percentage of Hispanic people in all the professions. Or they'll look at representation in government and they'll say, well, if we don't have X number of this or that ethnic, gender, whatever group in Congress or in the cabinet or whatever, well, that means that there's just rank discrimination. That's the root cause of that. Sowell debunks a lot of that mythology because he shows how group differences can be rooted in all kinds of things, and not just genetic factors. He's not necessarily a genetic determinist like like some of the far right, more race realist types are. He's more in the view that that social factors represent a convergence of phenomena that could include everything from just historical factors, to be sure, but also cultural differences and personality differences among individuals, and just sheer accidents of history or geographical conditions, all kinds of things. For example, there's the question of why are landlocked areas, why do those tend to be more conservative in terms of their cultural orientation, but they're also more likely to be poor, as opposed to areas that are near water? Why do those tend to be more quote unquote liberal or cosmopolitan in their cultural orientation, but they're also more inclined to be wealthy? Of course, not that those are absolute categories, and clearly there's one of the reasons for that is sheer geographical factors. It's, besides things like the content of the population that you find in different locations. So that's where I think Sowell is at his strongest. There are weaknesses in the application of some of his thought, the way he uses it, and also I think that it's also important to stay away from a one-dimensional interpretation of any particular thing. Like, you could, like, there are people on the left, they'll say, well, the real difference between the left and right is that the right wants to uphold systems of power and dominance and oppression, and the left is against oppression and wants everybody to have rights and freedom and that kind of stuff. It's a very narrow, deterministic, one-dimensional, reductionist view of politics. And so it's possible to take the constrained versus unconstrained vision model and apply that in a similarly reductionist way, and that undermines its credibility and legitimacy. And it's the same is true with many other models. The one that's about tradition versus progress. There are some people who say, well, a conservative is somebody that just wants to hold up progress. They're too stuck to the ways of the past. But then at the same time, the conservative side would be, maybe you should be hesitant to change just anything to change something, because you might break something in the process, or you might lose something of value, or you might cause unseen harms you can't participate, and that overlaps, can't anticipate, and that overlaps with Sowell's thought in various ways as well. So Sowell's model is a very interesting lens on which you can, through which you can view politics and social conflict and things like that.
Right. So some of my thoughts on the conflict divisions. One, like you, Keith, I've watched a ton of Sowell over the years, so I'm somewhat familiar with this broader, meta. And then also I watched, videos preparing for this that discuss the conflict divisions. He talks about like one side having a pessimistic view of humanity and the other side having an optimistic view, a perfectible view. In the particular interview that I think you, Aleksey, recommended we watch on the Hoover Institute, he mentions also because of this view of humanity, the constrained vision wants limits on political power rather than giving the executive or somebody unlimited access to political power. Now, what's interesting is that would put many on the alt-right on the position of the unconstrained vision, right? Because think of the National Socialists. They believe they could perfect humanity by controlling biological factors, controlling environmental factors, and many on the alt-right would point to that. So that's sort of interesting. But I think also the kind of political position that he represents, an economic position, isn't really the constrained vision. Now, he might have, there's Thomas Sowell with his theory hat on, where he's like writing about this theory with its pros and cons. And then there's Thomas Sowell, the political pundit. And I don't really think that he represents a constrained vision at all. So, I mean, first of all, throughout all of Western history up until, Adam Smith, nobody was going to say that greed was a virtue. But apparently now amongst, American conservatives and the libertarians and the broader capitalist community, that's a virtue. Now, Aristotle, who's often invoked as someone who has a constrained vision of man, argues that because man's desires are unlimited, they should be restrained, including a man's desire to acquire capital. But, there's an implicit concession that, well, as long as you, work hard, there's no such thing as obscene profits, but only obscene losses. This is a thing you used to hear in the libertarian socialist debates. Well, it's a completely unconstrained view. Like, if man is flawed and man does have a dark side, that would be a massive moral hazard that could cause problems for himself and for the community, which, the bourgeois revolution says no. They just totally throw that out. See, because what really is going on here is that the bourgeois revolution, which begins in the 17th century, where the bourgeoisie takes power from the feudal classes in Europe, and finally is finished by the end of World War I, is this idea that order was overthrown, and they're like, whoa, the socialists are going too far. It's like, whoa, put the brakes, pump the brakes, people. We didn't want to go this far. But they've sort of already moved in a direction that benefits them, and they don't want to yield in face of this threat. So they claim that, well, we're constrained and the other side's not. But this idea, there was a video that I watched called Conflict of Visions, Thomas Sowell, Constrained versus Unconstrained Vision, which was a pretty good discussion of it. The idea that this video producer points out is that Smith and Sowell both believe that the dynamic system of the market is what should govern society. So individuals make rational choices, and then that's the best way to organize society, as opposed to like an elite coterie of academics or apparatchiks who are making decisions for the rest of the country. But again, if you were to go to any prior period in Western history and say that we should let market forces decide how everything works, and then individuals within the market are maximizing the interest, everybody would have said you're crazy. That's a consequence of the bourgeois revolution, not some, right? If you want to be like a conservative, a true conservative, and a true unconstrained vision, you're going to want to advocate something like perennialism, where there's these universal principles that, throughout history, mankind has observed. And at no point does rational individuals acting in a market ever fall into that category. That's just as much constructed as the socialist vision that they dislike. And as you mentioned privately, Keith, before, Thomas Sowell was an advocate of nation building in the Middle East. Given that the founding fathers are often held up as an example of a constrained vision, one might think of John Quincy Adams. America does not go in search of monsters to destroy. Yeah, that's a foreign policy of a constrained vision, whereas what practically Sowell advocated for was a international policy of an unconstrained vision. I just don't see how that's you can get around that. And so what I would kind of argue is Sowell himself actually an advocate of a constrained vision? Now, in one sense, there are constraints that he places on society, what we might call market discipline, and the sort of like global commons maintained by the U.S. military post-1945. But on the other hand, like the socialists who he argues are unconstrained are constrained in other ways, right? They constrain how much wealth an individual can have. They constrain economic activity to a degree that Sowell finds objectionable. But the thing is that they both sort of have constraints. And then furthermore, it seems that the way this argument is used is that the left is unconstrained and the right, the left is unconstrained and the right is constrained. But then we have, say, for example, the anarchist Kropotkin, who in his Anarchism, Its Philosophy and Ideal writes, when we ask for the abolition of the state and its organs, we are always told that we dream of a society composed of men better than they are in reality. But no, 1,000 times no. All we ask is that men should not be made worse than they are by such institutions. So on the one hand, that statement sounds like a constrained vision coming from Kropotkin. But because he's advocating for the abolition of the state, and presumably capitalism as it existed at the time, Sowell would claim he's unconstrained. I'm like, well, how does the actual application of this look? Because that seems to me, at least here in this statement, an expression of an unconstrained view. And then what were your thoughts, Florian? Oh, you're muted, Florian. Well, you're not muted, but we can't hear you anymore. You're still muted. There you go. Yep.
You can hear me now, right?
Yeah, can hear you now.
God, this piece of junk. I'm sorry. Okay. So I think what remains constrained and unconstrained is depending on what each side thinks it's common sense, right? There are many points where I would say Sowell is also advocates an unconstrained vision, like as you said, Todd. But I would first ask Aleksey, when Lenin wanted to create the new Soviet man, and you wanted to use chess players as an example that everyone can make it, right? So what happened to the ones who didn't make it? Like, were they like swept aside and they just didn't talk about them? Because there must be some players that the Soviets tried to, some people that the Soviets tried to turn into chess players that didn't work out, right? And you know, in a way, then going further, when we say that the socialists or the communists in the USSR actually turned conservative, did they go back to a constrained vision, or did they just, once you have entrenched your power, are you just then engaging in risk reduction, right? You don't want to take on any ventures out because that is too risky. So you want to stick with the institutions you have, and then just keep a constrained view because of that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're conservative, right? And so that's always curious to me, in which way the constrained versus unconstrained vision is just different levels of risk reduction or risk reward, risk aversity. And you could say that conservatives are more risk averse than liberals, and liberals tend to be clustering around the younger, right? The younger people are more willing to take risks, right? And the older you get, the more conservative and more constrained you become. Yeah, but that doesn't mean that, in your heart you can still be a socialist and believe in those principles, but you will be in your personal life also be more constrained, right? I think one of the most interesting points here to me is when the left or liberals think we have to make sure that there's equity in society, right? So why do they have affirmative action? Why do they want to have some quotas of how many people of each race or of each gender, sex can be in a certain position? They could as well just do blind auditions or blind applications, right? So whenever you apply for a job or for a university, you're not giving your gender, your sex, you're not giving your race. You just just like your application and your experiences on there, and nothing else. And if you have the vision that there's a blank slate and that men and women are exactly the same, you should not need to enforce this equity or this equality, right? Or equity is equality of outcomes. You should not need to engage in that, because according to your belief, it'll just work out, right? If you just take away constraints that people will use to categorize the other people, right? So if you just take away their like, they don't write which gender they are, which race they are, it should all work out. But instead, socialists are always engaging in a very strong level of like affirmative action, or they'll make all these rules and laws. And it seems for them it's like freedom is just one more law away. Why do you need to do that if you have an unconstrained vision, right? So that also for that reason, I'm also not entirely sure whether it's a good paradigm to say to speak of constrained versus unconstrained vision, right? In a way, if you're libertarian or if you're minarchist or something like that, then you are most unconstrained because you want to minimize the institution that hold that that hold the impulses of mankind back, and you say just like as long as you don't violate the non-aggression principle, you're fine, right? That's a pretty unconstrained vision in and of itself, because it just gives a platform to people to develop into whatever they want to be, right? Without mandating certain quotas. That's what I would say to Sowell's principles, right? Yeah, that's as a last point in that, I would ask why do people that believe in unconstrained vision, why do the socialist revolution always produce such carnage, and why are some groups always put down? Because an unconstrained vision could mean the new human, the new Soviet, the new man. Everyone can become that, so you should encourage everyone to become that, and not put down violently some people that don't believe in that.
Okay, Aleksey.
Okay, so there is a lot to respond to, right? So, Florian, I'll start with your question. What happened with the Soviet chess players who did not make it to the top? Well, they did not get to live this luxurious lifestyle that's afforded to the grandmasters. That's all there is to it. And what you brought up is a really interesting point. How did the vision of human nature of the Communist Party change after the Communist Party has become entrenched in Soviet politics? In my opinion, they've adopted a much more constrained vision of humanity since Lenin. I would say Stalin, for example, deviated from Lenin's and Trotsky's international communism to socialism in one country. In fact, Stalin was famous for rather non-interventionist foreign policy. Interestingly, when Khrushchev came to power, Khrushchev was generally a liberal by the standards of the Soviet Union. He de-Stalinized society. And with Khrushchev, in a way, it seems that although the tensions of the Cold War have relaxed a lot, the Soviet Union has become much more involved in the affairs of other countries. It's not a coincidence that the Vietnam War erupted in the 60s, not in the 50s, not under Stalin. So Khrushchev, I would say, represents a rather more idealistic and side of Soviet politics, and less constrained vision of humanity than Stalin's. After that, let's say, so when Brezhnev took power, he re-Stalinized society. Brezhnev largely rejected Khrushchev's liberalism. Brezhnev was the arch-conservative in the 70s who undermined liberties, who implemented measures of social control that Stalin had in place, and effectively made society much more totalitarian than it used to be under Stalin. Now, than it used to be under Khrushchev, excuse me. Now, what does this have to do with the constrained or the unconstrained vision of humanity? Well, it's fairly simple. That by the time Khrushchev was president, the Soviet premier, and Anatoly Karpov was the top chess player in the Soviet Union, right after Bobby Fischer refused to defend his crown, it was immediately obvious that people vary in talent. Nobody at the time really put much thought into Lenin's new Soviet man idea. That was already a joke. In fact, in the 1970s, it was fashionable to make fun of socialism. Well, what's real socialism? I guess everybody has real money, but nobody doesn't actually buy anything. And that was the time when there were lines at the bread store, lines for basic commodities. Socialism was failing, and that's when the communists have become the very dogmatic party who had to accept some practical, pragmatic measures of limitations of human nature and limitations of socialism, for that matter. In the 1970s, the black markets flourished in the Soviet Union to remedy the obvious shortcomings of socialist economics. Khrushchev knew about it, but he wasn't about to put all these black marketeers in the gulag. To him, it was self-evidently true that obviously something is seriously wrong with the economy of socialism. And of course, he wouldn't say that publicly. Yeah, it's evident that he was not an ideologue, certainly not an idealist the way Trotsky made him. And as far as the unconstrained vision of international politics, well, Khrushchev generally was not the biggest adversary, of the United States when compared to other Soviet premiers. For example, Khrushchev would offer some tepid support to people like Salvador Allende, for example, or some Asian communists, or Cuba's Castro. Castro's Cuba, but he was not exactly all that gung-ho about it. So to me, it seems to me that Khrushchev had a much more constrained vision of humanity than somebody like Khrushchev, or a true believer in socialism. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Todd, you brought up how a libertarian idea of the free markets seems to be more in line with the unconstrained vision of humanity, and Tom Sowell did write about that. In fact, he cited Godwin as an example of an anarchist thinker with libertarian leanings, as an example of a supporter of the free markets with an unconstrained vision of humanity. Yet Tom Sowell draws a distinction between Godwin and Adam Smith. You see, for Godwin, Godwin is an individualist. Godwin believed that in an anarchy, people can truly flourish, and the free markets empowers them to be more generous and productive. Yet Adam Smith had a different point of view. Adam Smith's book is not called The Prosperity of Individuals. In fact, Adam Smith's book was called The Wealth of Nations. Smith had a more collectivist outlook on the defense of the markets. To him, the individuals making rational choice in the market was really a means to an end, a means to the end of enriching society and fostering social justice. In fact, this is one often overlooked aspect of Adam Smith's political economy. That Smith believed that the free trade promoted social justice, as it encouraged people to be more productive. It rewarded people who contributed value to society and punished those who chose to contribute things that were not particularly valuable. See, what does this have to do with the constrained vision of humanity? Sowell turns to Friedrich Hayek's defense of Smith's ideas. Sowell wrote a famous essay called The Use of Knowledge in the Economy, where he argued that through an exchange of ideas, people are able to correct one another. People are able to benefit from knowledge they share. Nobody has the final word on anything. In a way, this is similar to John Stuart Mill's argument on politics. So if politics is to be treated like a science, and there is fallibility, and people get to correct one another and examine each other's thesis, there are better results. So to me, John Stuart Mill's and Adam Smith's views are similar in the sense that they both espouse a constrained vision of humanity. And Sowell sees a parallel between that and Edmund Burke, who argued that laws and traditions evolve gradually and over time, that nobody should ever be so arrogant as to presume that they know how to fix the economy, or nobody should be so arrogant as to say that they would let's just scrap the legal framework and rebuild it from scratch the way it was done in the French Revolution. That's errant folly. That's incredibly foolhardy. If you have a constrained vision of humanity, the first thing you must accept is that your knowledge has limitations. That you've got to be realistic. You've got to be humble about the lacunae in your knowledge, about the gaps in your knowledge. You've got to be aware of how you need to rely on traditions and existing laws. You need to rely on precedents. In fact, Thomas Sowell went on to say that the English common law is an example of a constrained legal framework, constrained vision that's compatible with Edmund Burke's conservatism. And in the common law tradition, we judges look for precedents. The judges don't just get to rule in a way that they feel is just. But in a civil law tradition, that happens. For example, if a criminal is prosecuted in Spain or France, what often happens is that he's taken to the judge, and the judge just makes a decision based on the available evidence. and the judge imposes a criminal a sentence or a fine that the judge believes to be equitable, believes to be morally appropriate. That's the civil law unconstrained version of humanity. If you have a constrained version of humanity, there are strict guidelines for judges to follow. There are precedents to respect, and they must, and they sometimes have to rule in a way that they may feel is unjust, because in a constrained version of humanity, there are no single judge, no matter how brilliant they may be, can ever know more than the sum total of the nation's traditions and laws and history. So, for example, take Antonin Scalia. He's an example of a justice with a constrained version of humanity. As an originalist, Scalia believed that it was his duty to interpret the Constitution the way that the Founding Fathers did. On the other hand, Ronald Dworkin had an unconstrained version of humanity, and he thought that the Constitution should be a living and a breathing document, that we stand on the shoulders of giants, that we should override what we think, to override the mistakes of our ancestors. That's a fundamental distinction. And also, Todd, you made a good observation about how Tom Sowell's support for Bush's foreign policy is clearly an example of an unconstrained version, but Sowell actually responded to that criticism in his book. Sowell said that as a patriot in a country who has a patriot with a constrained version of humanity, Sowell has a moral responsibility to support his country, even when the country behaves in a way that's unreasonable or unjust, for the same reason the judge must sometimes pass a ruling that he or she feels to be unjust. See, Sowell would say that although the nation building in the Middle East seems like an example of an unconstrained version, as overlooks the Burkean version of conservatism, that institutions must evolve gradually and organically, it is his duty to support the American tradition, which is manifest destiny and American exceptionalism. As flawed as Sowell may feel, or anybody else may feel, the neocon invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan may have been, it's not the citizens' place to question that, because that's consistent with the American tradition. Now, of course, that is to be distinguished from a case like Adolf Hitler's, where one may argue that, well, at the very least, maybe Hitler's anti-Semitism may have been consistent with the German Volkisch culture, folk culture, but invading nations constantly and practicing genocide, that's perhaps un-German. That is so repugnant that it does not represent the traditional values of any society. Now, in that case, one would reject the duty to support the leader, even if one has a constrained version, because it seems to be to go against the grain of what counts as humane action, representative of the nation's character. So Sowell would ask, is there something fundamentally un-American about the invasion of Iraq? And you got to wonder, is there a precedent for this? Yes, there is. Andrew Jackson's Trail of Tears, for one. But there are plenty. How many foreign interventions has the U.S. staged since its inception? At least 71, with Hawaii, the annexation of Hawaii being among the first cases, and the Mexican-American War featured as a prominent example. So as far as Sowell is concerned, all his support for Bushism was nothing more than a constrained version's preference for upholding the nation's traditions and learning and letting the collective wisdom of our forebears take priority over our sense of justice.
Okay, Keith. You're muted, Keith.
I think that some of the things Aleksey was just discussing point to some of the limitations of Sowell's thinking, because on one hand, like I said before, the model of realism versus utopianism is an interesting way to look at politics and, by extension, human nature and things like that. We can certainly look at figures from the past that we could contrast as having a realist versus utopian or constrained or unconstrained vision. Like if you look at thinkers like Machiavelli, Hobbes, Metternich, Clausewitz, Carl Schmitt, those are thinkers that I would put more in an unconstrained category, because they were not utopians. They had a realist view of human nature and human capabilities and things like that. Whereas if you look at thinkers like, well, Plato was probably one, Thomas More is one, Marx is probably one, Rousseau certainly is one, Trotsky, as I mentioned earlier, is obviously one. Charles Fourier is one of my favorite examples. Some of these are certainly people with a utopian vision. And so I think that is a very interesting way of looking at politics, that those who have a view that human capabilities are limited versus those who think human potential is unlimited. But as far as the model that Sowell uses, I think it's only one of many lenses through which you can look at things. But the application, I do think, is problematic because, as we've been saying, when you say an unconstrained versus a constrained vision, well, does that mean that if you have a constrained vision, you just uphold tradition for its own sake? In which case, then you would have to throw out the entire body of American conservative thought, because America is an inherently liberal nation. Now, I suppose you could say, well, liberalism is our conservatism, and that makes sense up to a point. But in traditional conservatism, like European style conservatism or Asian style conservatism, or at least their equivalent of it, the idea of a free market economy, as Todd said, is something that would be considered profoundly unconservative. In all of these older philosophical systems, there's a great suspicion of the merchant class. The idea that the merchant class should be the ruling class would have been an anathema to the Greeks, to the Chinese, to all these ancient systems of thought. Now, Sowell would argue, I guess, from some kind of conservative collectivist perspective that, well, the market economy produces better results. But that seems fairly arbitrary, because one thing that Sowell talks about in a lot of his writing is this concept of trade-offs. He says, well, all policies are trade-offs. For every, if you want this benefit, you might have to sacrifice this other benefit. All right, but then you get into a lot of arbitrariness. Like a lot of mainstream American-style conservatives, they seem to believe that, well, whatever advances the GDP is the best policy. All right, there's nothing conservative or constrained about that. A more serious conservative would say, well, economic values have to be balanced with preserving culture or social stability or social cohesion or non-material values or spiritual values or family values. That's a more serious way of looking at things from a conservative perspective. I've written, in fact, I actually have a book called Thinkers Against Modernity, where I examined the views of a range of European conservative thinkers who are very different from each other in many ways. And there's also, I recently reviewed a couple of books by Nima Parvini discussing some of these European-style conservative traditions as well. And in that tradition, in that kind of conservatism, there is this emphasis on trading off on different values against each other, saying, well, you can't have this if you want this, and that kind of thing. The Amish, that's an example of a conservative culture, because when it comes to technology, they will say, well, just because this technology is available doesn't mean we're going to use it, because we might lose some other important value in the process, like community cohesion or traditional culture or something that they think is more valuable. But when I have read Sowell, he constantly criticizes what he considers to be opponents of the free market, saying, well, they undermine innovation. They undermine economic growth. Well, that's based on the value judgment that innovation and economic growth are the highest, or near close to being the highest values. The same thing with Sowell's views on crime. He's known for having very law and order-ish views on crime. All right, but the idea of a crime-free society, you could say that represents an unconstrained vision, because you could say, well, human nature being what it is, of course we're always going to have crime. We just have to strive for harm reduction, not a crime-free utopia. And also, even when we're striving to reduce crime, that has to be balanced with the trade-off of things like, well, how much money, public revenue do we want to spend on police? How many laws do we want to have? Do we want to keep the state at bay? What about preventing injustice against individuals who are wrongfully accused? do we want to have a police state where you can be arrested on mere suspicion and subject to indefinite detention? And if you had that, maybe you would reduce common crime like muggings or something like that on the street. But at what cost? So that's I think is more of a constrained vision that recognizes trade-offs. Also you could argue that the Chinese, that their contemporary economic model comes closer to being conservative than, say, what the free market, Milton Friedman-esque, Margaret Thatcher-esque type of conservatives believe. Because China, their leadership would say markets are fine when it comes to generating wealth or technology or economic growth, but we don't let the market define the essence of our society. They would say, well, we are a socialist society committed to these ideals, or in some cases they may appeal to historic tradition, Confucius, or whatever. But in that context, they would say, look, one example of this is Lee Kuan Yew, the former president of Singapore. Now, he wasn't a Marxist; he was sort of a nationalist, or his economic model was somewhat similar to fascism. But he was big on economic growth and development. But he always said, that doesn't mean we have a total free-for-all. That doesn't mean the market dominates everything. And he would appeal to Confucian traditions and these, Asian culture and all these kinds of things. And I think that's closer to being an actual conservative viewpoint, and one that has more of a constrained vision. The idea that the market is fine, but it's not all there is, and there are other things that are more important. Or when we're dealing with policy issues, we have to trade off contending values against each other. As far as the foreign policy stuff, the nation building stuff, the conservative types, at least in American political culture, and the mainstream conservatives, I'm not talking about the more dissident conservatives or the paleocons, the Pat Buchanan types, but your standard right of center, Republican-oriented conservatives. They'll always say, we've got to have strong national defense, and we've got to have military intervention because we got to keep the bad guys at bay. Yeah, but what if your side are the bad guys? Does that matter? That's an interesting question. Maybe the people you're fighting are the good guys. Maybe what your side is doing is actually something that's going to cause a lot of death and destruction. During the Vietnam War, there was a common phrase, "My country, right or wrong," or another one was "love it or leave it." Well, to my mind, that's just a fool's way of thinking. That's something a slave would believe. It's that you just follow the leader regardless of what the leader does is nonsensical. So all of these things are limitations or weaknesses that I see in Sowell's model. That doesn't mean the model itself is discredited or worthless or useless, but it shows that it's a limited model, that when doing political analysis, you would need to supplement Sowell's way of looking at it, whatever its value, with other models that are competing models but of equal value.
Okay, Florian.
Yeah, I think looking at what Keith and Aleksey said, basically, and I want to give a short sideway into Carl Schmitt. He was one of the chief legal ideologues, if you can say that. He was a law professor, and he was one of the chief legal. He provided a lot of legal justification for what the Nazis did in 1933 to 1945. So if you really look at him, what his role was, then and you're aware that in Nuremberg they executed Rosenberg, who was a chief ideologue of the Nazis. But actually, Carl Schmitt got pretty much off scot-free in Nuremberg. I mean, he could have probably made an argument to execute him too, because he had more impact than Rosenberg had. But so yeah, he only got a few months in jail or something like that. And then he could never practice again, but he didn't mind. He just lived in his house and then had all the philosophers and all the legal experts come visit him over the next decades. But that's just aside. I think the central weakness of the constrained versus unconstrained vision is it does not make a distinction between just upholding institutions and those that want to entrench or even increase their power, right? It's our institutions are there to hold back the worst human moral perversions of the worst human instincts. That's why we want to constrain human there. But conservatives again and again, and even Sowell himself, they all justified and went there to expand the empire, to expand their power, and to entrench and increase the power of the state. And that is a weakness that the unconstrained versus constrained vision model does not make. And I think that's the central weakness.
Okay, we'll move into final statements. I'll just say that, as with many things, Thomas Sowell is thought-provoking. There's a lot to learn from this, even if many of us have here concluded that the conflict of visions is incomplete or insufficient in some ways. That's my thoughts. Final thoughts, Aleksey.
Final thoughts. Well, I'd say the most important takeaway from Sowell is that there are only trade-offs, no solutions. And Keith, I believe you mentioned that a linear view of history is fundamentally, on the other hand, conservatives tend to have a cyclical view of history. And that leaves the question of what's progress. Well, all right, so if we take the perspective of the fourth turn that we discussed several times, there are four kinds of epochs within an 88-year period. So for example, now we live at a time when there's massive social change going on. Most of these trends are negative, generally speaking. However, the advantage of being in this era is that we now have the position to choose a new social order. This was not possible in the 90s or 80s, for instance. The free market fundamentalism was the norm, but it's not anymore. So that's one potential advantage. And then, say, if you take an era like the 1960s, which is often romanticized by liberals and vilified by conservatives, think about the trade-offs. The 1960s was a time of the civil rights. So the biggest advantage the biggest benefit of the 1960s and the awakening era, the 60s and 70s, is that ethnic minorities have received more rights or even privileges. The war in Vietnam has been protested heavily. The civil rights movement has taken off, but at what cost did this happen? Well, at the cost of having higher crime, at the cost of undermining the nuclear family, at the cost of economic decline. See, this is a clear illustration of how history moves in cycles, because there are trade-offs everywhere. And what about now? Where are we now? Now we have less racism, less sexism, less discrimination than we ever get in America. But at what cost did we achieve this? That's a question that we should ask from Sowell's perspective. Well, the cost is that we have less social cohesion. The cost is that we don't have a coherent American identity. The cost is massive economic insecurity and rising crime and inability to fight a war properly. That's been the case for at least 20 years since the Bush administration. The inability to really define American interest in a geopolitical sense. So now is the time when the civil rights dogma has become so deeply entrenched that we have a reason to look back upon the 1940s, the 50s, and wonder, what are we missing? How did we lose so much civic virtue? What happened to our middle class? Why is there so much individualism and the spirit of community is waning every year? That is a clear example that the progress in and of itself is an illusion. See, progress for liberals is essentially what we've already achieved, what's already happening now, and there can never be enough non-racism or non-sexism and non-whatever, anti-feminist, anti-turfism, or not enough, or less environmental homophobia. See, what liberals keep on saying repeatedly with their dogmatic Marxist linear view of history is that these ideals, utopian ideals, must be achieved at any cost. Has Paul Krugman ever talked about trade-offs? Has Paul Krugman ever talked about the possibility, about the price we will pay for bridging the economic gap? What will our economy shrink? Will we achieve less potential if we have more equality? Will the American individualism and commitment to the First Amendment decline of the social justice warriors start passing more hate speech laws and laws against certain thoughts? That's a question that certainly no liberal talking head like Robert Reich will ever raise. See, if you've got to ask a liberal one fundamental question. That's great that you want to fight racism. We agree with you that racism is a terrible thing, but at what cost do you want to defeat racism or sexism or whatever it is? Yeah, that's a question to try out with any liberal. So suppose we agree with you, that we'll jump on your bandwagon, but at what cost are we going to pay for this?
Okay, Keith, final thoughts.
It seems to me that people who could be conventionally identified as right wing and people who could be conventionally identified as left wing both have their own constrained and unconstrained visions in many ways, because it's certainly true, for example, as Aleksey was just saying, that a lot of people from the left have what I call a scorched earth policy when it comes to fighting racism and sexism. Like fighting racism and sexism can never be too extreme. You can't do enough, no matter how much progress we make, say, as far as raising the status of blacks or women. Well, it's still not enough. As Aleksey just said in the chat here, that COVID is another policy and example, and that's certainly true as well. You had people on the liberal side, the conventionally liberal side of that issue, saying we need a scorched earth policy when it comes to fighting COVID. As long as one person dies of COVID, that's too many. So that's certainly an unconstrained vision, or at least certainly one that lacks trade-offs. I think conservatives have their own version of that about issues of other types. Crime is one. I've come across conservative thinkers that seem to think, well, anything goes as long as it's fighting crime. And while fighting crime is a necessary and admirable goal, there are limits in terms of what you can or should do when it comes to fighting crime. I mean, do you want to have, say, a model of society like Saddam Hussein or something like that when it comes to fighting crime? Todd just said in the chat that anything goes is fighting America's enemies. Yeah, that's certainly the neocon perspective. Now, you could argue they're not really conservatives, and historically they're not, but you do find people who identify as conservative who feel that way. In the 1970s and 80s, there was this thing called the war on drugs that we don't hear much about anymore. But the war on drugs, I would say, was an unconstrained vision, because it was based on this idea of wanting to have a utopia where nobody ever engages in drug abuse or becomes a drug addict and things like that. And some of the methods used to wage the war on drugs were somewhat extravagant. And even today, a lot of conservative-minded people look back on that and say, well, that actually had the effect of undermining, say, constitutional rights or engendered social decay in other ways and things like that. And these are just a few examples. Interestingly, I believe it was Aleksey that mentioned John Stuart Mill. Sowell, in the Vision of the Anointed, actually cites John Stuart Mill as somebody with an unconstrained vision. And the reason he argued that was because I believe Sowell's argument was that John Stuart Mill believed that the educated classes should be free of social opprobrium. One reason for that was that John Stuart Mill was having an affair with a married woman, or maybe he was married and having an affair with somebody else. I forget the story, but that was somewhat scandalous in that time, more so than it would be now. And then he basically said, well, someone of intellectual status like myself should be exempt from social opprobrium. It's meaning nobody should criticize me. And it's very similar to the attitude you get from a lot of social justice warrior type people today who will say, well, because I belong to this or that group that was once oppressed or suffers discrimination, well, then I'm immune to criticism, things of that nature. So I do think that both sides, so to speak, people who identify as liberal, people who do identify as conservative, have their own constrained and unconstrained tendencies. And then that gets into the question that we can talk about on a future program about whether the left and right really mean anything in any objectively definable sense. There's this idea that, well, the left are utopians, the right are realists, or the left are for equality, the right are for hierarchy, or the left is for progress, the right is for tradition. But what is progress? What is tradition? for example, these anarcho-primitivist people, they're considered leftists, but I mean, that's the most conservative reactionary viewpoint there is, back to the prehistoric era. So it seems somewhat subjective.
All right, you get the last word, Florian.
Yeah, okay. My last word would be, and that's maybe a version of applying Sowell's visions to your own life. So I think everyone should be as unconstrained as they want to be. And by that, I mean, you should be unconstrained in your visions. And that's not trivial, because some people don't even allow themselves to dream big. Seriously, they never think they could be, they have some kind of like, something holds them back to really dream of what they could be. But so that's your dreams and your visions, they should be unconstrained. But you should also accept that there are constraints in real life, but don't accept the constraints that society puts on you. Discover them yourselves, right? With some common sense, observe around you, and then discover them for yourselves. And that would be my take-home message. So kind of like a slant to bring Sowell into more like a personal self-empowerment or self-discovery. And I think it would be interesting to actually look at this work under that paradigm, or under that lens, if you will.
All right. Thank you, Aleksey, Keith, and Florian. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.